Good morning and welcome to New Hope Church. My name is Rob Lauder and I am sitting in for Pastor Brooks today because she cannot be here. Today we'll be talking about Daniel chapter 4. As a reminder, let's go over the book of Daniel as a whole. The book of Daniel is a 2nd century BC or BCE, before Common Era, biblical apocalypse with an ostensible 6th century BCE setting. An apocalypse is a certain defined form of literature that we'll discuss in a little bit, but it was common back then in that time period for people to write with that sort of form. The book comes in 2 parts. It's a set of 6 court stories in chapters 1 through 6 that's written mostly in Aramaic, and 4 apocalyptic visions in chapters 7 through 12, and that's written mostly in Hebrew. And the thought is that it's possible that these were written at different times and combined to form the final book that we see today. Actually, the Catholic Bible and the Orthodox Bible contain extra chapters that aren't in the Protestant form. So it's been in flux, and some people think it should have been in the Apocrypha. I believe it's the last book. Daniel is the last book that got into the canon. The message, though, is just as good today as it was way back then. The message is that just as the God of Israel saves Daniel from his enemies in the time of the exile, so he would save all of Israel in their present oppression under Antiochus Epiphanes, and the same way God would save us today. This message from Daniel influenced the authors of the Gospels and of Revelation. You find the same imagery threaded through Ezekiel, through Daniel, and through Revelation, as well as in sections of the Gospels. But our focus today is chapter 4. Let's open our Bibles and read the Word of God. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream, interpret it for me. These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it, the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it, every creature was fed. In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms of the earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Belteshazzar answered, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds. Your Majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. Your Majesty saw a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. This is the interpretation, Your Majesty, and this is the decree that the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from the people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on the earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, Your Majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and by the glory of my majesty? Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from the people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and with the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me from the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. So let's take a closer look at this story about the supremacy of God. The Bible is divided up into an Old Testament and a New Testament. And the Old Testament contains 9 of the 10 time periods that I have set up in this slide. The period covered by Daniel is highlighted in yellow, the Babylonian, Persian, and Greek periods. The Babylonian period is the period in which the story is set, but the Greek period is the period in which the story is actually written. The Roman period that you see below that is the only one of these segments that actually takes place in the New Testament. So Daniel chapter 4 takes place during this Greek period, the last of the highlighted periods on the previous slide. During this period, Antiochus Epiphanes was the Greek or Hellenistic king of the Seleucid Empire, which covered the area in which Jerusalem existed. He was king from 175 BC or BCE until his death in 164. So it was a relatively short period, about 11 years. But he was very successful in that time and nearly conquered all of Egypt. He is also well known, however, for the persecution of the Jews of Judea and Samaria, and for the fact that the rebellion of the Jewish Maccabees occurred during his reign. The bust on the right is actually a bust of Antiochus Epiphanes from a museum in Berlin. Now, years ago, when I first met Pastor Brooks, teaching a Bible class, she gave us all a laminated card that was entitled A Quick Reference Guide for Biblical Interpretation. And I didn't reproduce the entire card here, and I hope we can talk a little bit more about it next week. But the main items on the card are shown here. Number one, the genre or the literary form of the story you're reading in the Bible. Number two is the historical and cultural context of that section you're reading. And three is contextual. Four is lexical or words. Five is theological. Six is a comparison with what other people's interpretation is. And then seven is the application of that interpretation to modern day life. Let's start with the genre. Here I have listed a few modern literary forms or genres for us to discuss. The first one is a letter. Everybody knows what a letter is. When you get one in the mail, it has a date at the top. It has a return address, maybe your address. It has a salutation like, Dear John, and then it starts in. And it usually ends with something like, Sincerely yours at the bottom, and then it's signed by whoever sent it. Another literary form is a comic book. Everybody knows what a comic book is. It's cartoons with short phrases tied to each one of the characters. It's not deep literature. Everybody knows when you read a comic book, you're not reading something that is necessarily historically correct or scientifically correct. Its primary purpose is entertainment. There are very narrow literary forms like literary modernism, and there are literary forms like newspaper articles in history that we are familiar with in everyday life. The newspaper article actually shown on this slide from The World lists a banner headline that says Titanic sinking, no lives lost. I like that headline because it was a breaking story at the time and they had picked it up off of the telegraph, which was a very new instrument at that time. And they had gotten a telegraph message from the Carpathia that everyone the Carpathia had recovered had survived. And so this erroneous headline got out and was actually kept and reproduced here, but I got it off the internet from an archive. But there's no mistaking when you look at something of this form that it's a newspaper and that it's meant to convey a certain type of information that's considered accurate. But even in the days of the newspaper's been around for a few centuries now. And in the early days, there were much more opinion and less what we would call news than they are these days. In fact, what we think of as modern journalism is actually only about 100 years old. And part of the reason for that is that you need a system of traceable references to support modern journalism. And that system of traceable references is electronic, and it really started with the telegraph. And so that takes you back maybe to 1860 at the earliest, when you could get news in a rapid fashion that was traceable. And what we think of as unbiased newspaper reporting only has existed for that last 150 years or so, 160 years. And before then, everything was basically opinion. History as a genre, and the way we know it, has only been around really since the printing press, because before then, there weren't enough books. It was too difficult to make a book. A Bible, for example, in a town 1,000 years ago, there would only be one Bible in the entire town, and the priest would have that Bible. And everyone that wanted to know what was in the Bible would come on Sundays or on another day, and the priest would teach them what was in the Bible. But it was the most valuable thing generally in the entire town, and they wouldn't give it out. Only the priest kept it, and basically only the priest could read it in most cases in these small towns. So the genre of history and the genre of newspaper article or journalism didn't really exist in biblical times. So you can't pick up really any story in the Bible and interpret it like it was a newspaper article or like it was a chapter in a history book, because that literary form just didn't exist back then. Other literary forms, like we see over on the right, like fiction and poetry and drama, they did exist thousands of years ago. So they're the same now as they were then. But some of these more narrow technology-focused ones, like newspaper article and history, they're really a product of modern times. And modern people pick up everything and interpret it like it was one of these forms when it couldn't possibly be, because that form simply didn't exist. And we don't want to fall into that error. And that's why genre is listed as the #1 item in your quick guide to biblical interpretation. When you pick up something in the Bible and begin to read it, you need to figure out what the genre is so that you know how to properly interpret it. You don't interpret a comic book the same way you interpret a newspaper. Now, in the Bible, we find some of the same literary forms that we saw on the previous slide that exist today, like fiction, for example, and letter. But we also find some forms that aren't as common today, like myth. A myth, by the way, doesn't mean a story that's false. In a literary sense, a myth is a story that actually has a lot of truth in it. It's a fictional story that's meant to orient people in a moral world. Other forms in the Bible include the parable and the debate, like we have in Job, the parables that we saw in the Gospels of Jesus, and there are also some Old Testament parables, allegories, songs and poems. We see, for example, with Psalms, and we see the letters of Paul in the Bible. So letters is a literary form that existed thousands of years ago and still exists today. But what we really want to point out today is in bold here, the apocalyptic literary form, because that is really the form that we see in the book of Daniel. Apocalyptic literature became common around 300 BC or BCE in the Greek period, if you remember our slide from earlier. And it lasted until about the year 100 AD or 100 CE. And it was used not only among the Jews and the Christians, but also among Greeks and Romans and Persians and Egyptians. The book of Daniel is a representative apocalyptic literature. And Daniel is the recipient of a divine revelation. You'll see when we get to that part of the book. And he has learned the wisdom of the Babylonian magicians, which we saw at the beginning of the book, and surpassed them, because God is the true source of knowledge. And he's the wise one, the wisest of them. The conventions of apocalyptic literature help you, that you see in this graph here, or this chart, show you what you should look for when you are looking at the Bible. And You'll find these in Ezekiel, and you'll find them in Daniel, and you'll find them in Revelation. And because there was a lot of other literature, if you dig into ancient literature, you'll find these in other works as well. But there are really 8 things that you look for. The first is that the work contains a hidden revelation known only to God. And it usually will state this, much as a letter says, Dear John, at the beginning, it tips you off that's a letter, or a newspaper has a headline. Apocalyptic literature will tell you at the beginning that it's a hidden revelation known only to God. And it will say that God or an angel gave the revelation to a person, and that the person received that revelation in a vision, and that the revelation is in a sealed book that's only to be opened at the end time. And the revelation is communicated through symbolic language and numbers. And the book is written by a venerated, famous figure of a past generation. And the setting of the book is a past time. So past historic events are presented as though they will be future events. Now, we see a lot of this in Daniel, and we even see it here in the beginning of Daniel, in the first 6 chapters, in chapter 4. We don't have a statement of a hidden revelation, but we do have visions that are not understood by most people, but only by one person whom God gives the ability to interpret it. We see Daniel himself as a venerated figure of a past generation. Daniel is mentioned other places in the Bible, most notably in Ezekiel, where he is tied to Lot and to Noah. And so he was a figure that was known way before the period of the Babylonian exile, and certainly way before the period of the Seleucid Empire and Antiochus Epiphanes. Again, the setting of this book is a past time, so past historic events are presented as they will be future events. So even though the strictly revelation apocalyptic part of the book of Daniel is the second half, many of the characteristics of the literature appear in the first 6 stories as well. And I think that's probably why they ended up all being grouped together, even though they were written in different languages and probably at different times. So why would people go to all the trouble to design a new literary form? Well, the author of the book of Daniel is encouraging persecuted Jews in a coded language. Setting the book in Babylon hundreds of years earlier is part of the apocalyptic form. The apocalyptic form enabled people to not only encourage each other during periods of persecution, but also to hide the fact that they are helping each other and to hide their criticism of the rulers of that time. The book of Daniel was written during the persecution under Antiochus Epiphanes and was quite probably between 167 and 164 BC. Antiochus actually died in 164, and that isn't mentioned anywhere in Daniel. So that lets us date pretty precisely when it was likely written. But at this time, the Jews were suffering through one of their worst periods of their history. Antiochus Epiphanes wanted to Hellenize or make Jewish life more Greek. So he issued an order outlawing the Jewish religion. He made it a capital offense to circumcise children, to possess a copy of the Torah, or to observe the Sabbath. His armies desecrated the temple in Jerusalem by erecting an altar to Zeus, which is that abomination of desolation that they mention later in the book of Daniel and that's been used in other places in the Bible as well as in other literature. This altar actually had pigs sacrificed on it to Zeus, and Jews were forced to honor Zeus and eat the meat of the pigs. If they refused, they had to run away and hide or die. Daniel chapter 1 addresses following God's teaching about eating unclean animals, the pigs that were being sacrificed on the altar. Chapter 2 is about the permanence of God's kingdom. Chapter 3 is about idol worship, that statue of Zeus. And today's scripture, chapter 4, is about the supremacy of God and not idols made by Greek artisans. At the top of this slide, we see an artist's rendition of Nebuchadnezzar when he was insane at the end of chapter 4. And on the right side, we see an actual Assyrian statue that is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There's no record in secular history of Nebuchadnezzar suffering from insanity, and it seems unlikely that he actually did. The records from the Babylonian Empire are pretty good. They've been recovered, they've been restored. There isn't anything like this in there, and the dates are fairly well known for the events that occurred. We don't really have time to get into Nebuchadnezzar's biography and when he died and how he died and the succession of kings that followed him. But it is well known and pretty well documented, and it is not the way it's presented in the book of Daniel. This is some of the evidence that people have put forward as supporting the writing of Daniel in the 2nd century BCE instead of during the Babylonian exile, because the dates are all correct for the events of the 2nd century, the prophetic dates, but the dates of the happenings during the Babylonian times are off and people are missing. It's what you would expect if the author had been in the 2nd century, but didn't have access to a good library and didn't have access to good history books to get the dates correct for the Babylonian exile. So where did the writer get the idea that this Babylonian king should be grazing on grass and insane? Well, one guess is that the Assyrians built statues in the shape of bulls with human heads and birds' wings to represent good luck deities, and that these became the inspiration for biblical cherubim. They were built in front of Sargon's palace, and they're characteristic of Assyria, just as characteristic as the pyramids are of Egypt and the pillared temples are of the Greeks. These figures or stories about them must have remained after the Assyrian Empire itself had been destroyed by the Babylonians. But by the time the Greeks came around, all kinds of imaginative stories must have been made up to account for these composite beings. And the tale of a Babylonian king who was forced to eat grass like an ox until his hair grew like eagle's feathers could be based on statues like this. To conclude for today, miracle stories are meant to arouse a sense of wonder. And for that reason, they cannot be realistic stories. The essential point in Daniel's stories is that God has the power to save or to do what's for the best. Daniel and his companions trust in God, and this liberates them to do whatever they ought to do, regardless of the immediate circumstances. The attitude is expressed in the words of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If we're thrown into a blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Their fidelity and their faithfulness to God is not conditional. This was true for the characters in the story at the time of the Babylonian exile. And it was what the author of Daniel, or authors of Daniel, wanted to convey to the Jews during the Greek period when Antiochus Epiphanes was persecuting them. Fidelity is not conditional. Daniel conveys a sense that God is in control and that everything is going to work out for the best. The will of God can be exercised through the rule of pagan kings as well as through Jewish kings. And faith and fidelity do not require any particular political system. God can work through anyone. Those messages, true in the time of the Babylonian exile, true in the time of the Seleucid Empire, are still true today.